So I'm writing a new book. What are you guys doing? Hey guys, welcome back to another writing vlog. I've been writing a new project called Body Back, which I haven't talked about yet on this channel. It's very exciting to me because it follows a character who's very near and dear to me. If you know anything about anything, you know that on this channel, I don't shut up about Harrison. The people who relate to me, okay? He's an icon, and I've been writing with him for a really long time. He is the protagonist of a novel that you guys might know about if you've caught my other vlogs called Seventh Virtue. What a lot of you might not know, because this project was a bit older, was Harrison was the protagonist to a duology that I wrote a couple of years ago called Mothwork. The first book was Mothwork, second book was Feeding Habits. Harrison's a character I've been writing for a really long time. In Seventh Virtue, he's 25, but before then, he was a chaotic little 21-year-old making bad decisions, and that spans the duology Mothwork and Feeding Habits. Basically, that duology chronicles his relationship with his sort of boyfriend, on and off ex-boyfriend, we don't really know, Lonan, and what it entails to kind of give yourself up for another person and then also realize that you need to find yourself again without that person in your life. I do have all about my novel videos on both of those novels if you'd like to check them out. They are literary fiction. They're on the shorter end in comparison to Seventh Virtue, which is a 200,000 word beast. Mothwork's 53,000 words. Feeding Habits is like 60,000 words. So I ended up writing Seventh Virtue just as like a fantasy version of that duology, pretty much. Again, it chronicles Lonan and Harrison's relationship, albeit it isn't as turbulent as it has been in Mothwork and Feeding Habits. Actually, their relationship is as positive as possible, I think, in Seventh Virtue, you know, despite like the stabbing, the bloodshed, the tears, it's, you know, pretty good in Seventh Virtue. I was doing a reread of Mothwork a couple of weeks ago, and I was super inspired by the story. I wrote that book when I was 17, and I was absolutely amazed at how good it was, because for a long time I was saying, I hate that book, I'm so embarrassed by it, and 21-year-old Rachel was embarrassed that 17 and 18-year-old Rachel ever thought the book was embarrassing to begin with. It actually inspired me so much that this whole idea for a new novella called Body Back, all caps is how I'm spelling it right now, came to fruition in my mind. So Harrison as a character is really interesting because he started out as a little 17-year-old who is like the mom friend, the leader of the group. Back when this series was young adult dystopian, I started writing Fostered when I had just turned 13 in 2014. It was amazing. I loved this character so much, and he was the only reason I actually continued writing this project, because my sister really fell in love with him. So thank you, Sarah. If not, none of this Harrison content would have existed. So if you like Harrison, let's say a big round of applause to Sarah. He's quite confident, he's funny, he's sarcastic, he's also a bit hot-headed, a bit impulsive, but more than anything, he's loyal and he is stubborn. And if he loves you, he loves you. Like, for the rest of your life, he's invested pretty much. He still has the exact same character design. He wears the same jacket. You know, he hasn't really changed in terms of character development, which is amazing because very accurate for him. Throughout the books, we get to see his personality get fiercer. Now, the Fostered series, where he originally comes from, was 6 books long. So by the time we get to book 2, he's 18, you know, developing his confidence. He's met Lonan. They're absolute enemies, because in YA dystopian, everybody was enemies, but you know, they hate each other, but also they work with each other. They kind of have to create an alliance against all odds. For some reason back then, didn't think that that would be like the most romantic situation I could toss these two people into. But anyway, by the time we get to book 3, Harrison is pissed and tired, pretty much. Lonan has done something terrible to him in book 2, and they just hate each other even more. Harrison is super protective over Reeve, who is the narrator of the series for a long time, and she's actually the dual narrator opposite him in Seventh Virtue. And really, that's his only focus. He's trying basically to do everything he can to help her, which is pretty accurate to, you know, Seventh Virtue in general. By the time we get to book 4, we start to see him soften up a little bit around Lonan, and generally as a person, he starts showing a little bit more vulnerability. It's mostly actually at the end of book 3 we get to see Harrison like opening up, which is quite nice. Him and Lonan actually create a friendship in book 3 of the series because, you know, Lonan goes through his Zuko-esque redemption arc, joins the good side. He is not the capital G government anymore. They end up kind of coming together a little bit. It's not quite friends. They're getting there. They're acquainted. Book 4, Harrison and Lonan, like, they get closer. Harrison, we see more vulnerability from. He's more of a person in terms of, you know, showing that he does have negative emotions. He's always been like the goofy friend trying to make people feel better. Book 5 is the same thing. He's really taken on this friendship role with Lonan. There might be more, there might be more. I don't know. Like, and by the time we get to book 5, there's a will they, won't they, maybe, kind of. Will they, won't they, in a bit of like a murder way also. We also get to see him starting to struggle, I think, with, you know, helping Lonan. Like, I mean, they're friends and he wants to help him. And I think that's one of Harrison's fatal flaws, is that he's a helper as a person. And we see the same thing in book 6 of Fostered, which is like the first time where we kind of get an understanding that, yeah, there might actually be a relationship here that isn't just friendship. Harrison just kind of continues on that path of like, he's got this like hard exterior, but it's also like, you can tell that he's like a sweetheart. He's like one of those strawberry candies that your grandma has in the purse. It's a hard candy shell on the outside, but you know, it's also strawberry candy. So that's Harrison's vibe pretty much. So then book 6 happens, we shift into Mothwork, which is like a direct continuation of book 6, but now we're in Harrison's point of view. The third person present tense, like limited to Harrison, we actually switch it to Lonan's point of view midway through and then back to Harrison's in Mothwork. The story really is Harrison's. It's about him learning to kind of put himself first. He's in this relationship with Lonan. We can definitely tell that there's some romance going on. They don't really know what's happening. Lonan doesn't really want to label anything. Harrison kind of wants to. They're on 2 different pages in terms of identity and what they actually are as, you know, a duo, which it causes a lot of tension. Like, that's a central issue in Mothwork. Mothwork really is Harrison not wanting to let Lonan go. They've known each other for 5 years. I think at this point they've probably had this will they, won't they on off thing maybe for 2 of those years or so. They've definitely grown a lot closer and he doesn't want to let that go. Spoiler alert, he does let that go in Mothwork. That's his arc. He starts not wanting to change. He's following Lonan everywhere. He's doing whatever he can to help Lonan. And Lonan is a bit unhelpable at this time. He doesn't really want to be helped. He's struggling with a whole bunch of really difficult things. Harrison has been trying to help him, but it's just not working. He doesn't want it, so he's not really going to change, right? Harrison realizes, well, I guess then that means I have to change, and he didn't want to, but he does, which is similar to the conflict in Seventh Virtue. The main conflict really is about changing your life even though you really don't want to. So Harrison ends up leaving Lonan at the end of Seventh Virtue, and he goes to live with his mother, Susanna, who lives in Las Vegas at this time. Lonan also lives in Las Vegas at this time. Lonan's new girlfriend, who this relationship he kind of stumbles into at the end of Mothwork, also lives in Las Vegas, and now Harrison's in Las Vegas with his mother, and you know, they're definitely not a thing anymore. And then Lonan's kind of in a new relationship with this woman named Eliza. They're both in the same city. In book 2 of the duology, which is called Feeding Habits, Harrison's no longer in Las Vegas. We don't actually know what happened to him in Las Vegas. All we know is there's a vague reference that Harrison was such a disaster in Las Vegas that his mother moved them all the way back. I believe they end up in Manhattan in Feeding Habits. So Harrison's originally from Brooklyn, but yeah, him and his mom end up moving to Manhattan. We don't really get much of an elaboration really on what happened. There's a bit of a scene where Harrison may or may not have gotten beaten up by somebody. We don't really know like the context. It shakes him and it shakes his mother so much that they're both like, well, you know, my disaster era has to end now. Let's go back home. Let's go back to New York City. Harrison doesn't have a chapter in Feeding Habits until chapter 6, because we start Feeding Habits in Lonan's point of view. So we shift to his point of view in chapter 6 when he is in Manhattan and he's trying to reconnect with an old friend. Now, you guys may have heard me refer to Reeve on this channel in Seventh Virtue. The old friend is Reeve because Reeve and Lonan are siblings. They share a mother and they're very, very close. Their siblingship was a huge thing in the original books. Unfortunately, they're quite separated. In book 6 of the series, Reeve ends up leaving the whole squad, like her friends, Lonan and Harrison, you know, Foster, who I've mentioned on this channel, Darren, like she ends up leaving all of them to like go start a new life, like without telling anybody. So she ends up in New York. Harrison's in New York. Harrison invites her over to him and his mother's apartment so that they can have dinner. The thing is, he has an underlying motive for doing that, and the motive is that he is just kind of craving to see a part of Lonan's face. Obviously, Lonan and Reeve look like each other, so that's why he invites her. Not because he actually cares, not because he actually wants to see her. He does a pretty shitty thing, and she knows that too. She knows the reason why she's there isn't because he actually cares about her situation, it's because he wants to see a glimpse of her brother. Which, Harrison, that's so complicated, the psychology. I don't know how I came up with that when I was 18, but like, that's amazing. Mothwork ends with Harrison letting go of Lonan. Feeding Habits begins with Harrison wanting to see Lonan again. What happens in the space between those things? Well, that's what I want to answer with Body Bag. I wanted to figure out what happened to Harrison in Las Vegas that got him to the point where in Feeding Habits, he's like, I need to see Lonen again, right? If Mothwork is Harrison being like, I don't want to let this man go. If Feeding Habits is, I need to see him again. What's in the middle is, I don't want to ever see you again. We didn't get to see Harrison develop that part of his psychology on the page. We get an inclination that he has some anger, he has some resentment toward Lonen. He's also kind of angry at himself. He's confused. He's very young. He's only 21 at this time. And so he doesn't really know what his place is in the world now that Lonen isn't in it. His whole world has been Lonen, and he doesn't know what to do with that information. Now that Lonen's gone, who is Harrison? He can't answer that question, and it bothers him. We see elements of Harrison struggling with sort of Lonen's presence in his life in a rewrite of chapter 7 of Feeding Habits. That chapter was called Weeping Statue, and I wrote it originally in 2020, and it was wrong. Like, it took me 2 years back in 2022, just a couple of months ago, to realize I'd screwed up that chapter, and I ended up rewriting the whole thing from the ground up, combined a couple of beats that happened in later chapters, and did a big revision so that what happened in chapter 7 of Feeding Habits was Harrison actually seeking out Lonen's presence. Now, he knows he can't actually find him because Lonen's across the country. For all he knows, Lonen's still in Las Vegas, and he is. He never leaves Las Vegas until, the very end of his point of view section in Feeding Habits when, he's driven into a lake. But Harrison ends up going to a church in chapter 7 of Feeding Habits, and he meets a man named Kale at the church. Kale is all wrong. Like, he is not Lonen at all. But Harrison's like, I'd be damned if I don't try and make him Lonen. Of course, he goes to a church because a big thing for Lonen is contending with religion. I mean, I'm just gonna put this out here. If you are a Christian viewer, I want you to be aware that this book deals with some sort of themes that could definitely be blasphemous. So I don't want to be disrespectful of people's beliefs. I grew up Catholic, so a lot of this stuff sort of injects in my writing now, but just so you're aware, from here on out, there's going to be some God talk. Lonen really struggles with his faith in Mothwork. It's a big issue for him. It's a big internal struggle. Also entails him contending with his sexuality and what that means with this religion that he grew up in. He constantly identifies as an atheist in Mothwork, but then is also like, I'm not. He's constantly talking about God and belief in the Bible and religious illusions and all of this stuff. Religion, specifically Catholicism, becomes a really big part of Lonen's identity. And if Harrison's looking for Lonen, he's gonna go to the biggest part of Lonen's identity, which is Catholicism. It's spirituality. In a lot of ways, Harrison sees Lonen as something adjacent to God. Now, I don't think he actually believes that he's a deity. He doesn't worship Lonen. No, not at all. I mean, the opposite. But Harrison is fascinated by Lonen's faith or lack thereof, right? Because, again, Lonen's like, I'm an atheist, but also let me just talk about God for the next chapter. And now that Lonen, who is the thing that reminds Harrison most of God, whenever he thinks of God, he thinks of religion, he thinks of Lonen because that's such a big part of Lonen's life. Now that Lonen's not in his life, he feels faithless. Harrison is not a faithful person. He grew up an atheist. His mother is not religious. I am an atheist now, so it's been interesting to sort of like play with both of their psychologies because I kind of have both experiences now. His sort of icon at the center of it all isn't there anymore. Harrison's like, well, great, now I don't have faith. What the hell do I do? Well, he gets mad, and that's a really big part of Body Bag. It's going to be contemplating faith. It's going to be contemplating gods. It's going to be contemplating men. It's going to be contemplating a lot of existential things. And it's something that really excites me because, again, this is not really part of Harrison's psychology. I'm almost developing Lonen psychology through Harrison's psychology because he's kind of putting himself in the position to be Lonen, and if he has to be Lonen, then he needs to look for a god. If Harrison's fatal flaw in Mothwork is not wanting to change, Body Bag is the opposite of that. We kind of need to see the two extremes to get us to the point in Feeding Habits where he's actually to a point where he wants to see this relationship again. Harrison is really in his fuck that guy era. I think He is mad at Lonan. He is mad at a god he doesn't believe in. He is mad at the world, his situation. He's mad at himself. He doesn't know how to exist, and it bothers him. So if you watch my video on the real reason you're a bad writer, I shared a scene, or a couple of scenes actually, from Mothwork where Harrison ends up meeting this man named Jeremiah who works at a motel, and they create a bit of a relationship. And in Feeding Habits, we get to see one flashback of the actual relationship that developed while Harrison was still in Las Vegas. We don't get to see much of it, but I wanted to bring Jeremiah back into the books. I thought he was a really interesting character, and what he sort of represents for Harrison, which is normalcy, normal 21-year-old things, isn't something that we get to see later in Feeding Habits. So this book is really kind of me redoing Feeding Habits, but in a different way. I hated writing Feeding Habits. It was the worst experience I've ever had writing anything. It made me question my worth as a writer. It really impacted my mental health. I struggled to separate myself from the project. If it wasn't working, it was very personal, and I was suffering a lot while writing that book. And a lot of it had to do with me being a very insecure person. And it's been 3 years since I started writing that book, and I'm a very, very different writer. And I wanted to take some time to be back in Harrison's head in this particular project to sort of redeem how terrible writing Feeding Habits was. And now I'm not expecting the writing process of Body Back to be perfect, but I've noticed the difference already. I go into the project mostly quite excited. Like, I'm interested to see what messy decision Harrison makes next, because the whole project is about making messy decisions. If he's not being a bad person, there's no point to Body Back. So I'm thinking the word count's gonna be maybe about 20,000 words. I'm almost 3,000 words into the draft, which is really exciting. I wanna finish a good chunk of it by the end of March. If I could hit 10K, that would be great, but we're already the first weekend, so we'll kind of see how it goes. I've been quite busy with school and my writing for school, so I'm interested to see if I can balance it. Some sort of basic info about the project. Again, it's adult literary fiction. The point of view is third person present tense. That's just the thing I've been loving. I've been rereading The Immortalists by Chloe Benjamin, which I read many, many, many years ago, and I've been rereading it because a good chunk of like the first point of view section, the first character's name is Simon. He ends up moving to San Francisco, and it's the 80s. It's also third person present tense, and the voice, I was like, I love third person present tense. So I'm not going to be publishing this. This is just going to be for me. I'm already really liking it, so I will share a lot of it on my blog, and I'll share some excerpts. The log line is, it's 2005 in Las Vegas, and 21-year-old Harrison is tired of routines, of gods, of men. On a mission to move past a complicated breakup, he's about to get recklessly indulgent, and he's come to the right place. If you want to hear about Harrison getting messy, this is the place to be. I'm very excited about it. In terms of inspo, I have been listening to a lot of Grayson Chance while writing this book, and also thinking about Harrison. Like, if you know, you know. Grayson is such an icon. I've been listening to Grayson's music since I was like a child. I've been listening to Trophies, which I think was his album from a couple of years ago, and then I caved and I bought Palladium because I just had to. All of the songs are Lonan and Harrison vibes, every single one of them. Some highlights that are particularly Body Back vibes. Honeysuckle is so Harrison. I will pop up the image that I drew of Harrison where he's actually in Body Back. It's going to be a scene that happens later. The context is that after, you know, maybe making some bad decisions, he ends up splitting open his head and ends up kind of lying in a field and like staring at the sky, thinking about something. What do you think he's thinking about? Starts with an L and ends with an Onan. There's a flower behind his ear. And in the live performance of Honeysuckle, Grayson has this flower behind his ear. So that was the director inspiration. And the lyrics are so Harrison in Body Back. The like, I don't give a fuck about other people. No one can touch me. From Palladium, Aloe Vera is so good. So Harrison. My Dying Spirit, Harrison and his mom vibes. Oh my God, so good. The whole album, he's just been very inspirational to me. I've also been listening to a lot of Marika Hackman, particularly her album, Any Human Friend. Basically the whole album. Honorable mention, Nothing But Thieves, What Did You Think When You Made Me This Way, which is an EP, which has always been Lonan's psychology. So it's funny that a lot of my Lonan songs have turned into Harrison songs, if that tells you anything about his psychology. So finally, what's the difference between Body Back and Mothwork and Feeding Habits and even Seventh Virtue. So obviously the biggest one here in terms of it being different from Seventh Virtue is that Body Back is completely literary fiction. There's no magical element. Seventh Virtue is the magical AU of Mothwork and Feeding Habits pretty much. In terms of the difference between Mothwork is, in Mothwork there is a really strong emphasis on caretaking, and Harrison doesn't want to be a caretaker at all. In Body Back, he doesn't even want to take care of himself, so he's gonna try to be as uncaring as possible. In Body Back, Feeding Habits has a really strong emphasis on Harrison's relationship with his mother, Susanna, who's a really big character in Feeding Habits. We're not gonna see her, I don't think, as much in Body Back because he doesn't really want to see her. She's like a bit too rational for what he wants in Body Back. Also, we see Harrison and Susanna at a very interesting point in their relationship in Mothwork. Susanna wasn't a great mother to Harrison. I mean, she like abandoned him when he was a child, and so he has had a really hard time kind of contending with that because they were always very, very close, and her circumstances were complicated. He's only now starting to understand that as an adult, but it's very gray area. It's very complex. In Mothwork, they end up reuniting quite unexpectedly, and it's not really a great reunion. The only reason he kind of goes to her at the end of the book is because he has nowhere else to go, because they had pretty much fought badly in Mothwork. So we see them struggling in their relationship in Mothwork, but then by the time we get to Feeding Habits, the relationship has repaired pretty much. They are close, they bake together, they paint their nails together, they enjoy their time together in Feeding Habits. There's some issues still, but we don't get to see the gap of sort of learning to get to that point where they can have a bit of a relationship, even if it is complicated. So obviously the difference between Seventh Virtue then is that we're not going to get any fantasy, and so it's not really going to be relevant. But what I did learn about Harrison in Seventh Virtue will likely apply in Body Back. The more I write him, the better I get to know him, right? I've been writing him for nearly 10 years, and I learn more and more about him every single day. So finally, I want to share a couple of excerpts from this project. These are pretty much first drafts. I don't usually like to give this disclaimer, but because I got a very funny hate comment on my last video, I'm letting you guys know that I share these excerpts with you so that you can see what a first draft looks like, so you can see a writer's process develop. Don't critique this writing in the comments. I'm not asking for any critique. I will make videos where I edit this or I edit other pieces of writing. On those videos, you're more than welcome to add in your 2 cents, but I'm just sharing this so you guys can see it because I think it's important that we're like more open about our drafts. I love the opening of Body Back, just to be fair anyway. So some context is that Body Back opens with Harrison floating in somebody else's pool. He doesn't own the pool, it's not his pool, he's fully clothed, like he's just chilling in a pool. Because what he's been doing is breaking into rich people houses and floating in their pool in the backyard, because that's so Harrison. So this comes from chapter 1 of the novella called Living Pictures, and this is the opening paragraph. Harrison doesn't need a god. Fully clothed in a stranger's pool, he pities people who do. So what if he's alone? The sunless sky is carbonated with stars, another stranger's backyard smelling like burned cedar wood and marijuana. And he likes it here, starfished on water that doesn't belong to him, inventing constellations while someone else's cigarette hangs from his lip. What god could manage this miracle? Take this drowsy tableau vivant, a man cloaked both by the sky's navy and his own jacket's leather, his eyes as wide as spoons. Harrison is fine art and God isn't. He wins. It's giving blasphemy. I don't know if you can tell from the style, we're going for glittery, glitzy chaos and self-destruction. This next bit, content warning, there's a bit of an implication of suicide. This is Harrison talking about his easy life and how tired he is of easiness. Technically, everything in Harrison's life is easy. He lives in an easy apartment, sleeps on his mother's easy Chesterfield, eats over easy eggs for breakfast, watches easy infomercials every night from midnight to 3 a.m. Technically, the infomercials aren't necessarily easy because he watches them in French without subtitles, but it's entertaining to make up slogans. Cut away your problems with a wrapping paper cutter, yeehaw! So he doesn't really mind. And he's grateful for this, how unassuming his life has become barely a month after Lonin. Perhaps this is how he views things in 2 simple parts, not before Christ but before Lonin, which now that he considers it, might be the same thing. Anyway, before his fawny portrait face, just like Renaissance men in oil on canvas. Before his blunt hands, before his raven hair, glassy as dark water. Now there's only one place left to go after. And how can Harrison complain? His easy mother has insured his easy sedan, which means he could get around the city easily if he wanted to. She's even offered to use her easy money to set him up in his own easy apartment. Imagine the view, she'd said as a selling point. And Harrison did. As Susanna unclogged the kitchen drain, he painted an easy coastline in watercolor and surrendered to the image of his easy, independent life. Easy trees like the date palms pinched against this couple's home. Easy skies, never a cloud, and an easy haven of blue. Easy walk to an organic farmer's market for easy pancetta if he wants it, or easy cinnamon butter that he has no purpose for, so eats straight from the jar. Easy morning coffee in an easy alternative garden right out his back door. Easy sand where there should be golden columbine, easy gravel where there should be soil, and the easy neighbors to greet, them going hello, and then him going hello. Harrison doesn't like easy. He'd rather walk all the way back to Brooklyn with nothing but an empty backpack and a sleeve of cigarettes, scale a silverish high-rise with his bare hands, struggle onto the vacant roof, stare out at the blinking, vulgar city, then climb onto the building's railings, let the wind ripple his jacket, his hair, and jump right off. He needs a hug and a therapist. So that's Body Back. Welcome to the project. Here's the cover, by the way. This is the interim cover. I still haven't made it officially. I want to make it by hand, like print out the images and do some cutouts and everything, but this is the digital version of it. And this is it next to the other books, so you can see the vibes. This project is really personal to me, and I've been kind of hesitating to share it on YouTube for that reason, because him and I are very close. I haven't written a character that is my age before. This is the first time I have ever written a narrator that is currently my age. I think it's a lovely experience. If you couldn't tell from the excerpt, we're melding kind of Seventh Virtue Harrison's goofiness with Mothwork Harrison's melancholic voice, and I love it. Like the yeehaw is really funny, but it's also something I really want to keep quite personal to me. I mean, I'll share a lot of it on Tumblr, but I'm not sure about on YouTube, so we'll see in future videos how much I share of it. I hope you guys like this project. I mean, I'm so freaking excited about it. It's so Harrison, and I'm excited to actually like deeply empathize with him because I hated him so much in Feeding Habits. I hated writing him, couldn't stand it. He basically ruined my experience is what I was saying. And I didn't understand that was because I wasn't letting myself see him as he was. I was kind of judging him. I wasn't giving him the space he needed to be messy and to be a 21-year-old who makes terrible decisions. It's only going to take place, I think, across maybe a couple of days, Body Back, because Harrison only lived in Las Vegas for, I think, 2 months. But we're going to get a lot of information, and I'm quite excited about it. So thank you guys so much for watching this vlog. That's it for now. I will see you guys in another video. Bye.